To see from your screen, our visiting speaker, Professor Krishan Kumar, is with us. Be highly disappointing, of course, if he wasn't. He is, as you will pick up, if you don't already know, when he speaks, that he is a Brit, though he has been in the USA for yonks. And he's an old friend of the centre. In fact, so old that I think it probably predates nearly everybody knowing about it in this webinar, because I think it was more than 20 years ago that you were a visiting fellow to the Centre, Krishan. You're very well known for your work on modernity, utopia, and nationalism, including the first substantial historical study on English nationalism. And Krishan is the university professor and William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia. Recently, he's turned his attention to empire, not just the British Empire or even European empires, but looking at empires globally and historically in the longue durée. And his recent publications on this theme include Visions of Empire, How 5 Imperial Regimes Shaped the World, book published in 2017, and his recent book published this year, Empires, a Historical and Political Sociology. And of course, it's the theme of his talk today, when he will be discussing a new book that also just came out this year, Kehinde Andrews, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. So thank you very much for joining us today and presenting to us today, Krishan, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tarek, and thanks to all of you for attending. I'm really delighted to be engaging on this subject with so many people. Of course, that's the extraordinary thing about Zoom. I see there were 67 participants, and I think it's most unlikely that there would have been that figure had I been in person at the seminar in Bristol, although of course I'd love to have been in Bristol. Let me just say two things by sort of way of introduction. Firstly, I apologize for the fact that I'm not using PowerPoint slides. I do use them, and I would like to in many ways, but we're in the last week of our semester here at the University of Virginia, and as you all probably know, this can be a very, very busy time. We're examining and assessing and having meetings, so I haven't really had time to prepare slides, so I'm just going to talk to you from notes. The other thing is just to explain how it is that I come to feature Kehinde Andrews' book as the sort of the reference point for this talk. The TLS, the Times Literary Supplement, sent me a number of books to review. They're mostly about the history of slavery in Britain and the abolition of slavery in Britain. But the history editor included in the set of books he sent me Kehinde Andrews' new book. As Tarek mentioned, you can see it if you like, that The New Age of Empire, it's called, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. Now, I have to confess, I didn't know about Kehinde Andrews. This, of course, has a lot to do with the fact that I've been living in America for the last 20 years or so, and I haven't really kept up with many of the things that are obviously very public in Britain. And I gather that Kehinde Andrews is really quite a well-known figure, public intellectual, appears, I'm just taking this from the notes in the book itself, that he's appeared on a lot of media programs and things like that. So many of you are probably much more familiar with him than I was. However, I was very struck by the book. And so I thought it might make a suitable subject for my talk. And here I know a number of things. One, I know this is a very controversial area. It's highly topical. It's so easy to tread on people's toes and upset them. There's no way of pretending that we can just have a purely dispassionate academic discussion about a subject like imperialism, colonialism, and slavery today, least of all, I imagine, in Bristol, which after all was one of the great slave ports of the 18th century, along with Liverpool and Glasgow, and as we know from recent events, has been heavily implicated in discussions about slavery and things like that. So we're in stormy waters here. We have to be careful, and I hope I'm not going to upset anybody. I just want to raise a number of questions particularly about the work, Kehinde Andrews' work, but also work that goes more or less in the same direction. He's by no means alone, of course, and he's perfectly well aware of that because he cites many people in support of his arguments. So we're talking here about a whole school, a whole tradition now that's developing around the themes of colonialism and imperialism and slavery as a kind of package, as an almost a single phenomenon, which has had an enormous impact on the development of the modern world. So I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read the book. I don't even know whether it's actually out yet. Perhaps it is. It says it's supposed to have come out in Britain, published by Penguin in February 2021. But what the TLS sent me was a proof copy. So I haven't actually seen the actual thing that came out. But I imagine some of you may well have seen it. But let me just quote a number of the statements, some very broad statements in Andrews's book. Let me say also that I think it's a very powerful and very passionate statement of a particular position. It's done incredibly well. It's very readable. It's very well documented. This is not some kind of screed or manifesto of the kind that we sometimes find. This is a very thoughtful and extremely well put argument. So I want it to be treated exactly in the way that it should be, which is to attend to its arguments with as much care as possible. But here are some of the statements. I'm just going to quote from the book. Andrew says that slavery, colonialism, and genocide are, quote, the key foundation stones upon which the West was built, and their legacies remain to this day, shaping both wealth and inequality in a hierarchy of white supremacy. Quoting him yet again, he says, white supremacy and therefore anti-blackness is the fundamental basis of the political and economic system of the West. Columbus, to continue Andrews's account, Columbus, he says, began the genocidal terror, that's his term, the genocidal terror unleashed on indigenous peoples that continued with the European empires and culminated in the Holocaust of European Jewry. And he then states, he says, in truth, the West was birthed by genocide. The West was birthed by genocide. Nor does he spare thought and culture emanating from Europe. He says, the European Enlightenment, the 18th century European Enlightenment, source of all that the West thinks progressive, was racist and imperialist and justified genocide. And he spent a considerable amount of time here discussing Immanuel Kant, the great German 18th century philosopher, as particularly guilty here of racism and imperialism and justifying the genocide of indigenous peoples. But Hume too, David Hume, comes in also for a considerable degree of criticism on the same score. And I would say that although he does not quote him, I think Andrews would agree wholeheartedly with Conrad's, Joseph Conrad's verdict in his famous novel, The Heart of Darkness, where he talks about the figure of Kurtz, who is this he's called Kurtz an emissary of science and progress. Kurtz is the European in the Congo region that's the subject of The Heart of Darkness. He's an emissary of science and progress. And Conrad comments, all Europe contributed to the making of courts. And he notes among the notes, and he mentions among the notes scrawled in Kurtz's writings, the injunction, exterminate the brutes. I think that view actually sums up quite well the view that Andrews presents in this book, The New Age of Empire, Exterminate the Brutes. And I was interested to see that just very recently, in fact, currently, HBO has a series directed and written by Raoul Peck called actually Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a kind of riff off Conrad, and actually covers very much the same ground as Andrews's book, with a similar argument that there's a genocidal streak in modern Western civilization that extends to the Holocaust. Now, all this is to say, I think, that what Andrews is presenting in this book is not, as I'm sure he would agree, not new. It's put together in a particularly powerful way, but he's drawing upon a certain tradition of thinking, which we're familiar with from the work of people like Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, perhaps Edward Said too, who of course draws upon both of these. In a somewhat different way, the school associated with Dirk Moses of the University of Sydney, and the scholars who study settler colonialism and who've written a lot about genocide and imperialism as somehow just two sides of the same face. So there's a lot here that comes from a very powerful tradition of thinking. And Andrews is, I think, extremely successful in the way he knits together the elements of thought that come from so many of these very influential thinkers. Now, what I want to do is not, obviously I can't deal with this vast thesis that Western civilization was birthed in genocide. There's so much there and so much to talk about there that it's going to be impossible to unpack all of that. What I'm going to do is just to take a number of strands of the argument and question some of them to suggest that there might be other ways of thinking about the phenomena, at least other ways that we might qualify some of the very strong and unequivocal statements that we find in Andrews's book. So it's really it's a questioning exercise, an exercise in raising certain questions. I think what I'm particularly concerned with is the kind of uniformity and homogeneity of the argument, the linking together of what I think can be treated in a somewhat different way: imperialism, colonialism, slavery, the Enlightenment, a whole series of events and movements in European history over the last 200 or 300 years, which are put together, packaged together as if it's an overwhelming, but in a sense, singular phenomenon. I think that's what I want to question, and that's what I'm going to do by picking up 2 or 3 of the strands in some of the claims that Andrews makes. Let me take, the first one is to do with slavery, and this is partly because the books I was sent to review by the TLS were in fact mostly histories of slavery in Britain. And I'm particularly interested in the argument that is made by Andrews, as well as some of these others, that slavery was essential, was necessary to the development of industrial capitalism, and to that extent was one of the cornerstones of the development of modern Western civilization. Slavery as a kind of necessary element in the development of industrial capitalism and Western civilization. Now here, he, along with many other thinkers now, have gone back to the classic work by Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery, which I reread. I read it years and years, I mean, decades ago as part of my undergraduate course in history at Cambridge many, many years ago, but I hadn't looked at it. And I'd come to think that in a sense that thesis had been refuted by many, many scholars. What I'm very struck by now is the resuscitation of Williams. I mean, he's very much a man of our times now. That book, Capitalism and Slavery, is now seen almost as an orthodoxy in many of the studies discussing slavery. Williams had in that book, which was first published in 1944, two theses. One was that, the more important one was that slavery was responsible for the wealth that was then invested in the early industrial revolution, particularly in Great Britain in the 19th century. And without that wealth, it's quite likely that the industrial revolution would never have taken off. That's the strong thesis, I think, in the Williams book. The second thesis was somewhat more controversial, was that capitalism not only depended on slavery for its origins, but it was capitalism that was responsible for the abolition of slavery. Because the capitalists, after a certain point, found slavery a barrier to the further development of industrial capitalism. They didn't need it, and in fact, they may have seen it as an impediment. Once they'd got the Industrial Revolution going, wage labor was much more preferable to slave labor. So either the capitalists simply allowed the abolitionists to have their way, or indeed encouraged them to have their way, because getting rid of slavery was something that was necessary for the further development of industrial capitalism. Along with people like Marx and Weber, one can say that these industrial capitalists could see that wage labor was a far more promising source of value than slave labor. And so they were perfectly happy to see slavery abolished in the 19th century. Now, many people have followed this line of argument. I'm particularly struck by the book by Sven Beckert that some of you might know, The Empire of Cotton, who just as Eric Williams argued that the sugar plantations of the Caribbean were the original sources of wealth for the Industrial Revolution, so Beckert argues that the cotton plantations, the slave-grown cotton plantations of the American South, were necessary for the further development of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. So even though slavery might be abolished in the British Empire, it certainly persisted and in fact flourished in the American South. And it was inextricably linked to the industrial capitalism developing, of course, in cities like Manchester, with Liverpool as the kind of nodal point of a worldwide empire of cotton. Very powerful book and a very powerful argument. So slavery continues to be part of the story of the development of industrial capitalism, even though it is abolished in the British Empire. And for many people, that's somehow a turning point in the history of the struggle against slavery. We have to remember that slavery continued in many parts elsewhere. In Cuba, for instance, the Spanish were very able to develop a very successful sugar industry based on slavery. And in Brazil, sugar too continued to be developed by processed by slaves until as late as 1888. So there's a lot of evidence here that the Williams thesis, at least in terms of its first argument, that slavery contributed to capitalism, I think is a very powerful argument. Where I think the argument comes unstuck, and it is an important point, is to argue that the abolition of slavery was itself a product of capitalism, that the capitalists favored the abolition of slavery. I think the evidence here has mounted up considerably against that view. I'm particularly taken with the arguments that have been advanced by people like Stanley Ingerman and Seymour Drescher, and slightly earlier, one of my former colleagues at the University of Kent, Roger Anstey, who worked on slavery in Africa, that slavery actually remained incredibly profitable on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean right into the 19th century. It wasn't ripe for abolition. It wasn't exhausted. There were new colonies like Trinidad and Tobago, which had come in, which the British were developing, and Guyana. These were thriving sugar plantations in the early 19th century, there was absolutely no reason to think that slavery had exhausted its potential at that point. And that was proved, I think, by what was going on in Cuba and in Brazil, and had been shown to be true also in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Had the Haitian Revolution not succeeded and abolished slavery in Saint-Domingue, Saint-Domingue was the most prosperous spot on the entire globe, according to many scholars, at the end of the 18th century. There was absolutely no reason to think that slavery had exhausted its potential there. It was the Haitian Revolution that overcame it. So what I want to say here is that we have to go back to some of the arguments that it was humanitarianism and moral reform that was key to the overthrow of slavery in Britain and elsewhere. It was indeed, as so often argued in the past, the efforts of people like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and Fowell Buxton, who actually sacrificed not just their health, but in some cases their lives to the struggle, to which we of course should add the struggles of the slaves themselves, the number of slave rebellions in Barbados in 1816, in Jamaica in 1830. These were all necessary for the overthrow of slavery, certainly in the British Empire, and of course the Haitian Revolution of 1804. We can't, in other words, buy the view that somehow capitalism was responsible both for the onset and the abolition of slavery, as Eric Williams argued. We really have to bring in other elements in Western societies to understand the source and the ending of slavery. We have to show that there are different currents at work, cultural and political and ideological, which are battling against each other in that whole story of the rise and abolition of slavery. And this brings me, I think, to a second feature now, which I want to introduce, what I think is actually missing to a good extent in Kehinde Andrews' book, although he occasionally mentions it. And that was the high degree of resistance and criticism of slavery and imperialism and colonialism within Western societies themselves. In other words, this was not simply the resistance of indigenous peoples, which clearly was there, nor simply the criticism that came from outside, but the internal criticism from within Western societies themselves. The importance of that critique seems to me very, very strong and important to insist on. Just to give you some examples, Edmund Burke, the great 18th century Edmund Burke thinker, Burke's criticism, his absolutely scarifying denunciation of British rule in India, which he conducted over a month's presentations in the House of Commons at the impeachment of Warren Hastings in 1784. There's almost nothing that you would need to add to the denunciation of British rule in India. In fact, the kind of arguments that you get in Shashi Tharoor's book, Inglorious Empire, what the British did to India, which has had such a success, so much of that is already contained in Edmund Burke's own denunciation of the rapacity of the British in India. I point again to the abolitionist movement, not just in the United Kingdom, but in the United States, the enormous efforts of the abolitionists. Of course, it took a civil war in the end in the United States to end slavery. But nobody, I think, looking at the history of slavery in the United States can deny the importance of the abolitionist movement, again, fed from so many different sources, moral, Christian, and others, but a moral crusade against slavery that came from people living in that country white people living in that country. Of course, again, there are slave narratives. Of course, the slaves contributed to the ending of slavery in America, just as they did to the ending of slavery in the British Empire. But what I'm wanting to insist on here is the enormous importance of the collaboration between indigenous people and European critics of empire as a long-standing tradition. I can point here again to the role of many Europeans in the independence movements in so many of the colonies. India, again, would be a very good example. One of the founders of the Indian National Congress was Alan Octavian Hume, son of a famous radical, Joseph Hume, from the early 19th century. But it was Octavian Hume who was one of the founders of the Indian National Congress and went on to champion the case for, in this original version, it was really more for home rule than for independence. But then you had campaigners like Annie Besant, admired by Indians both at the time and since. She's a real heroine of the Indian independence movement. Her campaigns on behalf of India, her collaboration with people like Gandhi for Indian independence is something I think that everybody who studied that movement is fully aware of. So again, I think one has to add people like that to the story of Indian independence. And perhaps I can throw in here the fact that when the famous Amritsar massacre occurred in 1919, when Colonel Dyer had his troops fire on unarmed Indians, killing hundreds of them, some of the most total denunciations of Dyer's actions came in the British Parliament, led, unbelievably almost, by no less a figure than Winston Churchill. If you read the speeches that Churchill gave in the Parliament denouncing Dyer's actions in the case of the Amritsar massacre, and the fact that the Parliament voted to convict Dyer for his behavior, again indicates the strength in Britain itself of feeling against that kind of action. That does not mean that they were renouncing the British Empire, but it also means that they were perfectly aware of some of the actions being conducted in the name of the British that they were prepared to denounce in absolutely no uncertain terms at all. And finally in the story, perhaps I can throw in the case of the missionaries in the empires, again, particularly the British, but the French and others. We're accustomed to thinking of the missionaries as somehow colluding with empire, that Christianity and capitalism, or Christianity and commerce, or Christianity and imperialism somehow went together. And I'm not denying that there are cases where missionaries can be seen as somehow handmaidens of the imperial enterprise, particularly in countries like Africa. But, you know, there's also so much evidence here of the way in which the missionaries were seen as the enemies of empire. These I'm talking about white missionaries were seen as enemies of the empire by so many of the imperial authorities. They were a constant thorn in the flesh of the imperial authorities. In India, they were actually banned in the first part of the 19th century. They were so annoying to the British authorities in terms of their attempts to defend Indians against what they thought the British were doing, protecting Indians in all kinds of ways. There's a whole tradition here going back to Bartolomé de las Casas and his defense of the Indians and these famous debates that took place in the 16th century, in which in many ways he actually won the debate against Sepúlveda, who was his main opponent. But Bartolomé de las Casas, again, is a hero among indigenous Indians in South America today. There's a whole tradition of people like Las Casas going all the way down into the 19th century, which I think we should be aware of and cannot see them simply as all aligned with colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and the things that are thought to have contributed to the way in which Western civilization developed. My third thing, my third example is the European Enlightenment, the 18th century European Enlightenment, which Andrews indicts as racist and imperialist and genocidal. And I saw also a quote from a British historian, Abigail Green, recently, where she talks about the Enlightenment as I quote, an unreflecting cloak for European domination and white privilege, an unreflecting cloak for European domination and white privilege. Yes, you can certainly find many racist statements in the 18th century, and certainly you can find it in the writings of people like Kant and Hume. But I also draw attention to an alternative tradition in the Enlightenment, which has been very, very well traced by the political theorist Sankar Muthu in his book Enlightenment Against Empire. Let me repeat that title, Enlightenment Against Empire. And here he studies the thought of people like Diderot and Voltaire and Herder and a whole lot of the other philosophers in their unremitting criticism of European ventures of imperialism and their treatment of indigenous peoples. We can go back, we don't have to wait for the Enlightenment, we can go back to Montaigne's essays in the 16th century. Again, famous essays like his Essays of Cannibals, which are searing indictments in terms actually not very different from Andrews's, searing indictment of what the Europeans were doing in the New World. Of course, he was particularly concerned there with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and as he saw increasingly, the French and the British and the Dutch, what they were doing in the New World. Montaigne doesn't mince his words any more than people like Herder and Diderot do in the 18th century in attacking European ventures in the New World. So I think we need to be much more careful in our analysis of what Enlightenment thought was all about. And of course, we know from the Frankfurt School, from the works of people like Adorno and Horkheimer on the Enlightenment, that there is perhaps a genocidal streak, perhaps a totalitarian streak in Enlightenment thought. We can derive certainly elements of that we can see as conducive to some of the things that happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. All I'm simply saying is let's be less uniform in our judgments. Let's complicate the story, because there's so much more evidence that goes against the notion that the Enlightenment in some unilinear way contributed to the Holocaust, that it leads directly from its thinking to the Holocaust and to the totalitarianism of 20th century civilization. I think that's something that the work, some of the more recent work by people like Jonathan Israel and Anthony Pagden, it seems to me, speak very clearly against that view of the Enlightenment. I think we can see that there were true elements of universalism in the Enlightenment that are not simply cloaks or facades for forms of European domination and white privilege in the way that Abigail Green suggests in the quote I've just made. Perhaps we can come finally to the much more controversial topic, much larger topic, that sees European imperialism as one single story of rapacity and brutality. This again is contained very much in the narrative that Kehinde Andrews presents to us, and it's also to be found in a number of other recent works. I want to just take here, and this is sort of my final point, I suppose, given the time. I just want to take here the example of a work that has been immensely popular, both in Britain and elsewhere. It originally came from a speech that Shashi Tharoor gave at the Oxford Union in 2015. It was actually a speech about reparations. and the need for Western societies to be prepared to give reparations back to the victims of slavery and colonialism and imperialism. And Tharu actually won that debate hands down, I think by a 2/3 majority. And on the strength of that, he was invited to write a book extending his views, which of course were very, very compressed and very rhetorical in the case of the Oxford Union debate. So he wrote this book, which came out in Britain. The title is Inglorious Empire, What the British Did to India. The original title actually was rather less provocative. The original title was An Era of Darkness, simply subtitled The British Empire in India. But nevertheless, it has been seen as an absolutely swingeing attack on British rule in India, and more generally a sense that this was somehow an indication of European imperialism throughout. It's a story of European empires everywhere. So it's a good indication of the way in which thinking has gone in relation to the European empires. Now, I want to simply say that again, we must question that very, very uniform view of the brutality and rapacity of British rule in India. And I want again here to call upon some of the indigenous voices, not here this time pointing to what Europeans might have said about the British in India, not simply, in other words, pointing to that critical tradition, which I drew attention to earlier on, but what some of the Indians themselves have said. And I want to quote from a speech given by the former Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, in 2005, which pointed to the way in which people like Gandhi and Nehru and the poet Rabindranath Tagore had tried to assess in a much more balanced way what the impact of British rule in India had been. Of course, wanting Indian independence, but also being prepared to see what the British may have contributed during their 200-year rule, something that I think qualifies in a rather important way the argument of people like Shashi Tharoor and Kehinde Andrews. This is what Manmohan Singh had to say in 2005. He says, "Today, with the balance and perspective offered by the passage of time and the benefit of hindsight, it is possible for an Indian Prime Minister to assert that India's experience with Britain had its beneficial consequences too. Our notions of the rule of law, of a constitutional government, of a free press, of a professional civil service, of modern universities and research laboratories have all been fashioned in the crucible where an age-old civilization of India met the dominant empire of the day. These are all elements which we still value and cherish. Our judiciary, our legal system, our bureaucracy, and our police are all great institutions derived from British Indian administration, and they have served our country exceedingly well." And Manmohan Singh continues, "The idea of India as enshrined in our constitution, with its emphasis on the principles of secularism, democracy, the rule of law, and above all, the equality of all human beings, irrespective of caste, community, language, or ethnicity, has deep roots in India's ancient culture and civilization. However, it is undeniable that the founding fathers of our republic were also greatly influenced by the ideas associated with the Age of Enlightenment in Europe. Our constitution remains a testimony to the enduring interplay between what is essentially Indian and what is very British in our intellectual heritage. Now, of course, that is by no means the final word in any sense of what the British did to India, and nor can it be in any sense the final word in how we assess the legacies of European colonialism and imperialism and even slavery. This is an argument that's going to continue, I think, for a long time to come. Some of it is technical, some of it has to do with the economic balance sheet of how much Europe derived in terms of sheer profit from its colonial rule and how much it paid for it. I think it's always going to be an extremely difficult thing to do. It depends a little bit on whether you're looking at the economics of the situation or the morality of the situation or the intellectual legacies. They don't necessarily all add up on the same side of the ledger. All I'm trying to ask here is that we unpack or unpick a story which wants to bundle together in one package, one uniform, unspeakable package of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, that its impact has been all in one direction. It continues to endure in the form of white supremacy and racism, all of which, of course, is absolutely undeniable as part, and certainly a very important part, of the legacy of European rule of the non-Western world. But the story, it seems to me, needs to be taken in a much more nuanced way. I think we simply have to be prepared to open up that package and look at the different elements and see to what extent that argument as a whole can hold up. I think that's really all I want to say in commenting on what I think is a very important and influential and certainly extremely topical contribution of the kind that we find in Kehinde Andrews' book. Perhaps, Tarek, I can pause here and ask for any comments or questions from the participants. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, Krishan. Let's do that. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, trying to bring out these different sides of European developments, whether they were economic, political, or intellectual. So people obviously can now ask Krishan questions. Could you indicate that you want to ask a question by using the Q&A function? And in fact, I see someone has put in a question there. So Danny Schmoller is asking, how does the notion of decolonization fit into a more nuanced view of the impact of imperialism and colonialism? Which I think is a very good question and something I was thinking myself as I was listening to you. So would you like to pick that up, Krishan?
Yes, maybe provocatively, I can put it in the form of the need to reflect on one of the slogans of many of the independence movements, the ones that led to independent nation states emerging out of the ruins of the European empires. And the slogan was, self-government is always preferable or more precious than good government. Self-government is always more precious than good government. And I want to say, is that necessarily true? Of course, in many ways, we all believe it's a kind of shibboleth of our nationalist age that self-government of any kind is preferable to good government. But when we see some of the things that have been done in the colonial, the ex-colonial world, I just wonder whether the decolonization story can be seen as a simple story of triumph of good over evil. I'm very impressed, or rather I should say rather depressed, by the story that Michael Mann tells in his his book, The Dark Side of Democracy, that you may well be familiar with, what Michael Mann does in that book is to take the nation state and nationalism as the cause of some of the worst horrors of the 20th century. These are nation states, these are states which emerged from empire at 1918, 1945, in Europe, in Central Europe, of course, as well as in Africa and Asia. And the record of some of the independent nation states which emerge out of empires is really a very, very dark one indeed. Now, I'm not saying that that means that independence is bad and that decolonization wasn't necessary. What I'm saying is, again, the story of decolonization, which is sometimes seen in sort of triumphalist terms, should make us question some of the things that emerge with it. Whether, in fact, many of the things that happen can be attributed purely to European rule as a legacy of European imperialism. I think that's been the tendency to see some of the things that occurred as to be laid at the door of the British or the French or the Belgians or the Dutch. And I'm just wondering whether we shouldn't look at the history of these independent states since independence to see whether there might not be other things to talk about in explaining some of the things that have happened there.
Yes, thank you, Krishan. I mean, we will have other questions. In fact, I can see one's coming. But if I could just kind of take that a step further, because I think a compelling part of your narrative, of your analysis, is that we can't simply look at economics as explaining the changes from slavery to abolition to industrial revolution and so on. Though, of course, slavery did make a very big contribution to the wealth of countries like Britain, and therefore also to the capital accumulation that then made certain kinds of economic developments possible. But there's got to be, and this is just, emphasizing what you said, there's got to be a political and ideological explanation as well, because we see a political and ideological shift. Otherwise we wouldn't, we'd still have the same ideas. And you mentioned, people like Kant and Hume. Well, when we now read Kant and Hume, we pick out the racist elements and say, no, this isn't part of the true message of Kantian or Humean views about morality and politics and ethics and so on. So in a way, wouldn't your argument need to engage with how has change taken place? Now, change obviously hasn't been comprehensive, and you yourself note that fact, of course, but clearly some change has taken place in ideas about white supremacy, about equality, and about, the general understanding of human diversity over, let's say, the last 200 years. So in a way, the next step of your argument would be to pick up the intellectual threads that you were pointing to in people like Montaigne and Diderot and Herder, and of course, lots of others, you mentioned the abolitionists and so on, to pick up that thread and see how those arguments were won. Is that right? Is that how you'd want to build your story?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying is that we can give a counter narrative to the kind of narrative that we find in Andrews's book and that of people who think like him, which is one strand. I suppose the question is it the dominant strand? Is the strand of racism and white supremacy the dominant strand in Western thought? Or is it one a very powerful one, but there are alternative strands. My stress is simply to say that there are alternative traditions which have at various points been able to oppose what we might think of as the dominant tendencies quite successfully. With the abolition of slavery being one of them, but also in the contributions that radical thought made towards independence movements and emancipation of all kinds. I mean, we can simply point to the effects of the American and French revolutions, simply the ideological fallout from those two revolutions. People have traced, David Armitage wrote a wonderful book on the American Declaration of Independence, which shows the impact of that Declaration of Independence in so many different parts of the world, so that actually all their constitutions more or less quote directly from the Declaration. So that contribution is what I'm trying to bring out, I think. I think there's a tendency for that to somehow get suppressed in this master narrative of the white supremacist tradition in European thought. And so there's a great danger, I think, of sweeping over these countercurrents, which it seems to me are in many ways equally important.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got a number of other questions. The next on the list is from Charlotte Fong Clark, and she asks, it definitely seems pertinent to understand and deconstruct the complexity of perspectives of colonialism and its impacts, but how much of its perceived benefits to ex-colonies by the colonized themselves are the result of an internalized coloniality or intellectual imperialism, Alatas's notion of the captive mind? So that's really a question about intellectual imperialism.
To what extent, in other words, this is really part of Edward Said's kind of argument, also particularly Frantz Fanon, the idea that the victims of colonialism were not simply oppressed economically and politically, but psychologically. I mean, the internalization of many strands, which I think is a very powerful argument. Again, I suppose you would want to say that is the clarification or the overcoming of that internalization not also partly drawn from European thought? I don't want to play down the importance of indigenous thinking. I think people like Partha Chatterjee and others who've looked at indigenous intellectual traditions to say that the sources of resistance can be found there as much as elsewhere are certainly right to point to that. But I think there's no doubt when you read the autobiographies of people like Jawaharlal Nehru or Gandhi's works, and people have been so prominent in movements to overthrow colonialism, how much they themselves admit their indebtedness to Western thought. I mean, Gandhi's Hind Swaraj is just full of praise for people like Tolstoy and Ruskin. These were his favorite writers, and so much of his thinking derives from the thinking of people like Tolstoy and Ruskin. So I think we can find within the works of so many so-called third world intellectuals the way they draw upon, partly because of their own education. I mean, so many of them were educated in the universities and the capitals, the metropolises of the empires, but they were able creatively to use these ideas against the rulers. That's the thing I think that's so important, the extent to which they could draw upon traditions of Western thought that could be turned against the West itself. I'm sure we can go all the way back to the Roman Empire. We can go back to Christianity in the Roman Empire. After all, the Roman Empire birthed Christianity, let's not forget that. But then Christianity turned out to be among the greatest critics of the empire in works like Augustine's City of God. So there's a counter narrative that seems to me that's been more or less permanent in Western thought, right from the very earliest days, which is a commentary on its own operations, on its own doings. And that applies, I think, to the imperial enterprise as well. Wherever the West established its colonies and its rules, Western thought could not be contained within one particular version or variety. it inevitably overflowed. The currents that were trying to be contained were inevitably overflowed, and people could read works and think about things that were extremely critical, and in the end, I think, undermined Western rule in the non-Western areas.
Thank you. The next question is from Merid Dunn. She asks, how does your more nuanced analysis relate to questions of gender?
I wish I had something to say about that, but I'm afraid I actually don't. I haven't really looked at that question in my own work. I'm very aware of people like Laura Stoller, I think, one of the great contributors to this debate, and I hope you know her work. I don't really have anything to say, I don't think, about gender, if we're talking about gender and empire, say. I don't really have anything to add to what I read from some of the other people commenting on the role of gender. So I'm really sorry, I can't add anything to what's been said. Okay.
Fair enough. So Werner van Wyk, I hope I pronounced that correctly. He says, "Dear Krishan, it would appear that there are currently many attacks leveled at the Enlightenment and its values. I share your assessment that a more nuanced perspective often shows these attacks to be flawed. Yet these attacks continue and appear to be on the increase. Do you have any views on why this might be? Is there perhaps a perspective that we are missing?"
I think there's no reason. I mean, it's not too difficult in a way to see why the attack has been mounted recently, because there is a very strong current that seems to be flowing through all Western societies that calls for a kind of reckoning with the past of Western societies, and a reckoning that perhaps has not been sort of conducted in a sufficient way. Certain icons of the West now are ready for toppling. I suppose this comes up with, there are probably episodes of this kind from previous periods as well. I'm not sure that it's an entirely new development, but we're certainly living in the midst of one of those at the moment, with so many works coming out and so many people coming out attacking particularly phenomena like the Enlightenment, showing the dark side of the Enlightenment. This is, one of those currents that is very, very strong at the moment. Publishers encourage it. Graduate students are encouraged to take on studies that emphasize this. Perhaps they feel that the story has not been told sufficiently well. I do think that ever since the Dialectics of the Enlightenment, the book by Horkheimer and Adorno came out, we've been living in a certain tradition of regarding the Enlightenment as the source of all our problems. So I don't think there's anything new in a way in attacking it. What is perhaps new is the kind of ferocity of the attack, the way in which people like Kant is pulled out. Andrews's book spent a lot of time on Immanuel Kant, and Kant is, after all, one of the icons of the Enlightenment. So to really go for him, to quote all the passages from his writings, which are racist, imperialist, perhaps even genocidal in tendency, that maybe is the newer thing, the degree of critical attack on things like the Enlightenment. That's perhaps the new thing. And I think it's going along with many other things, the whole debate about reparations in relation to slavery. I think a lot of these things in Britain came up at the time of the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007. Many things that happened then, the debates that have been launched by the University College London website about the legacies of slavery. all of these are feeding into a really powerful current of opposition to what has been seen in the past as one of the most progressive developments in Western civilization, the Enlightenment. It's up there for grabs. And so it doesn't surprise me. I think there will be, as so often happened after a certain point, there'll be a reaction. I think maybe it's already happening. I certainly see in the works that have recently appeared by people like Jonathan Israel, a very powerful attempt to recalibrate that kind of debate. But we'll see. But I certainly understand why it's happening. It's going with the current. It's really going with the current as things are at the moment.
Thanks. So there are a number of other questions in the pipeline. The next one's from Jeff Henderson. He asks, one of the problems with the literature you're criticizing is the failure to distinguish between different forms of colonialism and the social consequences of those differences. In terms of racism, it's the British form and its extensions, the US, Australia, that was more problematic than their Portuguese or Spanish versions. I spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and the contrast between the social legacies of British colonialism there and Portuguese colonialism in Macau were very noticeable. So the origin of this line of argument, I guess, was Tannenbaum's slave and citizen on Brazil vis-a-vis the British Caribbean and the US. It was Protestant religio-cultural formations that produced more virulent forms of racism than Catholic ones. What are your thoughts on this?
I'm extremely sympathetic to that view. I do think if you compare racism in the British colonies with, say, those in the Portuguese or Spanish, the intensity of racism does seem to be stronger in the British case, and it may be tied to religious differences, Protestantism versus Catholicism. I'm very aware. I think Portugal is a particularly interesting example to look at the ways in which the Portuguese ruled in Brazil and the legacies of Portuguese rule there and in Macau. I too have been to both Hong Kong and Macau, and I absolutely understand that point about the different legacies of the Portuguese and the British. Of course, this also emphasizes one of the points I want to make, which is for us to differentiate within the European imperial experience, that empire isn't all of the same kind, that the Portuguese did it one way, the Spanish did it another, the British, and indeed the French, because the French had a much more assimilationist attitude towards empire. If you look at the way the French ruled their colonies in North Africa, West Africa, and in Southeast Asia, they in effect tried to assimilate the peoples there to French culture. You know, Paris was in a sense the model, and many people there took to that. You can see it if you go to a city like Hanoi. The impact of French culture there remains so strong in so many ways, and certainly West Africa. So there are differences here. I did want to say, though, something about Hong Kong, which I do know very well because I spent many years going to Hong Kong. Yes, it may be true that if you compare Hong Kong with Macau, racism seems to be somehow more powerful, more virulent in Hong Kong, in the Hong Kong case, than Macau. But just think of what the people of Hong Kong themselves have been doing recently in resisting the pressure of Beijing on them. What have they done? They've gone back to British colonial rule. The British flag has been waved by protesters. They've called upon the traditions of British rule, the British rule of law. I mean, if you ask Hong Kongers, what do they see as the difference between them and mainland Chinese? Overwhelmingly, what they say is, we have the rule of law here. They don't have it over there. We have the rule of law, and that is a British legacy. The courts were admired in Hong Kong as actually giving a pretty good degree of fair judgment as between, say, Chinese and non-Chinese people. So there is a legacy in Hong Kong now, which, despite the undoubted racism that was there once Hong Kong had been developed by the British, but there's a legacy in institutions, in the language, the educational system, which is a among the best in Asia. If you look at the educational institutions in Hong Kong, they've got some of the best universities in the world. These were British creations, and they remain so, and the language of instruction remains British, remains English. They don't want to give that up. That's one of their badges of identity, as against the way they're being pushed by Beijing. So it's a complicated story, even in Hong Kong, even though I do agree with the main thrust of that view, that as far as racist attitudes were concerned, it's probably true that they were stronger in the Anglosphere, if we can use that expression, stronger in the Anglosphere than they were in the cases of the Latin people, the Catholic people.
Thank you. John Hart says, excellent presentation, many thanks. Can you speak to Andrews and others tapping into a long tradition of Western self-criticism? We seem to have turned Whig history on its head. We use the historical rear view mirror now not to admire our history of progressive government and human rights. Rather, history is increasingly the medium for identification of oppression, victimhood, and injustice.
Yes, of course. It is a reaction against the Whig view of history. It's a reaction against progressivist thought in general, much of which does stem from Enlightenment optimism, a certain kind of utopianism that you find in Enlightenment thinking and in other European strands. We are seeing a very strong reaction against that. I would say, again, this is picking up on developments that we can see surfacing at different times in Western history. I mean, if we go back to the late 19th, early 20th century, there was that great sense of decadence, the sense of the Western civilization being decadent, of being feeble, of needing injection of energy from particularly cultures like Africa. We get works like Spengler's Decline of the West, which has huge kind of, resonance in the populations. So already that progressivist narrative was deeply under attack in the 1920s and 1930s. Whether we're seeing something different now, I'm not entirely sure how to rate it. I think again, it's the intensity of the attacks now, I think, which are rather different. They're not as measured as they were. I mean, they could be pretty ferocious in the earlier period as well, particularly coming from the artists who never mince their words. But among intellectuals, I think that maybe that's the new thing, is taking that anti-progressivist element in Western thought, which is, of course, in Western thought itself, to a much higher degree. And those of you listening in, playing a part in this, probably have much better ideas as to why that might be going on. I mean, I have my sense of why it's happening here in America, because there's a renewed debate about slavery and the Black rights movement. It's everywhere. So it then goes into every aspect of American civilization. I imagine exactly the same thing is happening in Britain, and I'm not sure to what extent it's happening in other European countries, but certainly in Britain and the United States, one is aware now of a very, very powerful movement, which is influencing all of us in terms of the way we do our work and what we think about. We're all here, for instance, engaging in enormous numbers of exercises to do with teaching in the classroom, how we are to be more inclusive, more diverse in our teaching. We're being retrained, in effect. Some of the older people are finding it more difficult. We're being retrained to think about how we relate to our students, particularly our Black students. So there's a huge movement underway at the moment. And I see that as really driving a good deal of the intellectual life that we are considering today.
In fact, there is a question about decolonizing the curriculum, which you've touched on, but I'll wait till we get to that, because I'll just take them in the order that they popped up. So somebody asks, how can I assess recently published books on the topic of racism? Are they really necessary? Or, as you said earlier, these books deter readers' attention from a message contained in Declaration of Independence and of Marx's Communist Manifesto? Thanks.
So the question is really about the necessity or desirability of these new works. Is that what the question is asking, do you think? Why do we need them?
I think at one point you did say that some of the arguments that we hear today or in the middle of the 20th century and so on were prefigured in earlier debates. I mean, you went to Burke, for instance, and then you also mentioned people like Herder and, you know, the abolitionists and so on. So I think the question is, well, what's new, and are the books worth reading because there's enough new things in them?
I think absolutely, yes, they are worth reading. And I think every generation has to engage in this debate again and again in its own way and in its own language. You know, the language is very important here, the style with which the debate is conducted, the kind of words that are used. We have a new language now, I think, and particularly for younger people, it's very important that they are sort of educated in this new language. I mean, to read Burke is to read 18th century language and the terms of the debate, and they will not speak to people in the same way today. So even though I think many of the ideas, I would say, this may be an extreme thing, I think we can go back to Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century. The brilliant debates between him and Sepúlveda were incredibly subtle, and they drew upon such a weight of thought and reflection that I'm not sure that much has been added in real terms to the criticisms that they advanced of what Western societies were doing to non-Western people, indigenous peoples. But I do think that the point has to be made again and again and again. We might still draw upon these traditions, and I hope we will, because I think that's part of what education is all about, is not thinking that what we have to say is absolutely brand new and that nobody else has thought the way we have. We know that is wrong. But I think we do have to find a new way of saying it. So I think the way people like Kehinde Andrews is addressing us, that language is likely to have a much more powerful impact, and rightly, I think, on people. And an impact that might lead also to critical reflections of the kind that I'm making. I mean, this is a compliment, I think, to Andrews's book, that it makes me think about these kind of things. I hadn't really put them until I spoke today, actually. I've never actually expressed these views in the way that I just have. They're really entirely a series of responses to Andrews's book. So it's been tremendously helpful to me. So I really do think that language is important, how people couch the criticisms, how they couch the arguments. We have to keep finding new ways of doing it. Fanon found one way of doing it, so specific rhetoric in the Wretched of the Earth. Césaire, the poet, found another way of doing it. There are different modes of addressing these problems in the culture. And I think it's absolutely necessary that we should continue to allow these new voices to express these views in the way that they find relevant and urgent.
Gurinder Bambara asks, might the criticisms of the Enlightenment be thought of as nuanced in relation to previous accounts of the Enlightenment that made no mention of racism, colonialism, and slavery? Why is the call for nuance so one-sided? Further, how are we to understand the absence of colonialism and slavery from your own earlier work on industrial society and in the work of those like Mann and so on?
Good question, particularly in relation to my earlier work. I have a story to tell here, actually. When I was at Cambridge doing history, my tutor at my college, St. John's College, Cambridge, was Ronald Robinson, one of the most famous historians of empire. And like everybody else who was doing history with me, we didn't want to study empire. I didn't do a single course with Robinson. I wanted to read E.P. Thompson. I wanted to read Eric Hobsbawm. I wanted to read those kinds of people, those kind of debates, which were sort of Marxist orientated. And they hardly touched on empire at all. This is the extraordinary thing. I mean, I look back at my own education, how completely absent, despite the fact that I am myself very much a product of empire. I mean, I was born in Trinidad of Indian parents, and I lived in England for much of my life. I'm a complete creature of empire. But maybe that's a reason why it didn't strike me as something that I wanted to reflect on in that way. I was much more interested in revolution and ideas about industrial society. And that's what my early work was done about. So maybe, I mean, whether I should apologize for my past, I don't know, but that's the story of why I didn't engage with empire. It was only when I came to write the book about English national identity that I began to realize how important empire was in the case specifically of English national identity, because the argument of that book was that the English were and had been for a long, long time an imperial people, and the way to understand Englishness was really, in a sense, to understand it through empire. And that then catapulted me into looking at other imperial peoples and other empires, which is where I am now. But if you like, that's the autobiographical story of why empire was not there in my early work. It was I think there was, and I think I was very much part of a general feeling from about the 1960s to the 1980s. There was a kind of amnesia about empire. You look at the literature, it's not that there weren't scholars working on empire, but there were no great debates going on. The scholars were quietly doing their own work on empire, students were studying it, writing PhDs, but it wasn't a publicly debated thing. Because I think once the empires had gone, Europeans turned their backs on their empires. They wanted to forget about it. It's certainly true in France after Algeria. I think it was true in Britain. They turned their backs on it and concentrated on things like the European Union and saying, well, no, that's all behind us. We're now doing something new. It re-emerged in the 1980s, 1990s. I'm not quite sure. I think works like Linda Colley's Britons was very important for me in making me rethink my views about England and Englishness. The empire story suddenly began to come back in. So I'm just really one of the crowd. I think I just jumped on the bandwagon, which is not necessarily a nice thing to have done, but I think that's what I did. I could see this was emerging. And then you got, famous things like the TV series, Neil Ferguson's Empire, Jeremy Paxson's Empire. These two, again, brought the empire story very much into our minds. Now, I've forgotten what the first part of the question was. I think I've answered the second part, perhaps at greater length than you wanted. But
well, the first one is, you say you're offering a kind of nuanced set of critical questions that someone like Andrews needs to address. Kehinde was saying, well, isn't someone like Andrews or herself, her work, offering a correction to a previous historical consciousness, to a previous hegemonic intellectual perspective?
Absolutely, and I admire her work very much, as she knows, I think. Yes, no, it's really necessary to do that. Although again, I'm not sure how strongly that progressive interpretation of the Enlightenment had been. It was, of course, the original interpretation of the Enlightenment, that it was universalist, and this was Europe sort of opening up to the world. But I think the attack on it had started coming. Again, I refer to Horkheimer and Adorno in that work that they wrote, what was it, 1940, the Dialectics of the Enlightenment, really began the questioning in a very profound way of what the Enlightenment might mean. We've all, in a way, been living off the capital of that critique. Now, of course, it's been, and they didn't spend, of course, the amount of time on race and those kinds of issues. It was more to do with, rationalization and totalitarianism and those kinds of things. So adding race, I think, has been really important to bring that question into the Enlightenment, to question the Enlightenment on the ground either of its omissions, which were great, or its commissions in the direction of racism and imperialism, of course, has been an immensely valuable thing to do. And there's probably still a lot more work to be done on that. So I don't for a moment deny the importance of it. Again, you know, I'm repeating what I said in the answer to the last question. We have to do our work in new ways in our own generations. We cannot go back constantly to say, well, it was all said before. It may have been in some form, but the forms have to change, the direction of criticism have to change, the style of criticism has to change. So all this work is incredibly valuable. I live off it myself, Kehinde's work as well as Kehinde's work. So I take my hats off to them.
Yeah, so I said to you that there was a question about decolonizing the curriculum, and it's while it's next on the list, let's take that as the last question, because it's something obviously that we're all actively thinking about and working on. But I'll take what in the list was the final question, because it actually ties up very much with the last question and in your reply to it. So in a way, it's a little bit of a postscript, but you might want to add something to it. So it's from Ipek Demir. She says, Andrews is proving a corrective to the sweet story of Enlightenment, which you argue overdoes it. Who, according to you, has provided a nuanced view of Enlightenment, which examines its dark side and, you know, its positive contributions?
Well, I again refer you to what I think is a really excellent book, Sankar Muthu's Enlightenment Against Empire, because although he's trying to correct the view that the Enlightenment is sort of imperialist, so already in that work he's aware that people are criticizing the Enlightenment for being imperialist, and he's setting against that the writings of people like Diderot and Herder as counter to that view. But he does give plenty of time to the views of those who have argued that the Enlightenment contained within itself the seeds of racism, imperialism, and even perhaps genocide. So that work seems to me a very good work. And Muthu has edited a collection of essays on the Enlightenment and empire, more recently with contributions from many of the intellectual historians who've been writing about this. So I would say that's a pretty good and very balanced view. The work of people like Jonathan Israel and Anthony Pagden has tended to veer much more towards a defense of the progressivist view of the Enlightenment. So if you're looking at their works, I think they're very good works, and they do give you a very, very convincing account of the progressive and universalist elements of the Enlightenment, but they don't give as much time to the other view in the way I think that Sankar Muthu does. So I would very much suggest that one is well worth looking at. Now, you say decolonizing the curriculum, of course, is...
Why don't I read the question out? Because
yes, okay.
Cover, and we'll use this as the last question because we're coming to the end of our time. And also, if you want to add any, you know, summing up remarks, this will be your opportunity, Krishan. So Natasha says, you answered Danny's question about decolonization, but I'd like to raise the question about decolonizing the curriculum and Western thought more broadly. Is the wave of works, such as that by Andrews, filling a much needed void and pushing back against discourse on empire being good for the natives, which continues to dominate mainstream political and media discourse?
Well, I'm not sure whether I think that empire is good for the natives does continue to dominate media discourse. I'm much more aware, certainly here in America, of narratives and works like I mentioned the HBO series Exterminate the Brutes, and a whole series of things now about slavery, which go absolutely against that. I mean, the weight of media attention, certainly in the United States, is pushed entirely now on the victims of that, rather than people who may have triumphed. So I'm not sure that the narrative hasn't already changed quite radically in that way. But I absolutely accept that in there has to be an engagement. I'm so glad in a way that empire has become a popular subject, not just because it helps to sell my books, but because it's now much more a topic on the curricula. I teach myself courses in empires. I'm in touch with people all over the place who are teaching empires as part of their curricula, something that was not, I think, so common, and certainly not when I was a student. So it brings to attention the subject of empire and all that goes with it, colonialism, slavery, possibly even genocide. And we need works, of course, to engage that debate. So Kehinde Andrews' book is wonderful. I mean, I'm definitely going to recommend it to my students when I teach empires next time, because I think it's just a very good, strong, clear, and extremely well articulated view of the kind that they need to engage with, even if they want to criticize it in some of the ways that I might. It's an extremely good statement of a certain position, and I think we need other works of that kind, and I'm sure we will be getting them. Just how far you go with decolonizing the curriculum. I mean, I've heard many people talking about this. Some people are going in a very radical direction in this way. I think simply getting people to face the questions, particularly if we're talking about an academic setting, which I presume we are, when we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum, we're talking about universities and schools. How do you teach subjects like colonialism, slavery, and things of that kind? We need works for students to engage with that debate, and works that show all sides of the debate. So there's a pedagogic task in front of us all, I think, and I certainly want to play my part in it when I teach courses, as I do to undergraduates and graduates on subjects like empire. Then works like Andrews will be extremely valuable to me in that operation.
Well, that's a very good place to end up, to finish, both in terms of your appreciation and tribute to Kehinde Andrews and his book, and also to how you yourself are engaging as a teacher, as a lecturer, an educator with decolonizing the curriculum, but also the intellectual corpus of work that you're relying on in terms of empire and the taking stock in a new way of the last 250 years or so of Western European history, including the intellectual currents in that history, which have brought us to the point of this new present rethinking that we're at. So thank you very much, Krishan. I found that really very absorbing and engaging. And you made, the historical labors that you've engaged in, you've brought them to us in a very accessible form. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you everybody for joining us. We do have another seminar next week, and Thomas will send details of that shortly. I hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. So thank you everybody, and bye-bye. And thank you especially, Krishan.
Thank you. Thank you. May I just say my thanks to all of you, but also just to say that although I concentrated mostly about European empires in this talk and in my work, my next book is about the Chinese empire. So look out for an attempt to see empire from the East, because the Chinese are not just engaging in empire now, but they have for the last 2,000 years. So there's another story to be told about them as well. Thanks very much, everybody.
Fantastic.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.